Pokewilds is a game that makes me very excited, because Pokemon is a very frustrating series to be a fan of, but Pokewilds is doing something very unique and neat. Genuinely, something I have not seen done in sandbox games or in Pokemon games. And it all starts with this shitty little disc. I know for a lot of people these discs aren't too popular. However, here's my hot take. HMs are actually really good design when you think about it. To paraphrase an idea from the late Ronnie from Game Theory, older Pokemon games forced you to catch Pokemon in order to use moves that affect the overworld to progress through the game, which not only differentiated Pokemon, but is arguably a defensible design choice. Of course, as always, link to the original video below. This older Pokemon design philosophy makes it so that you need to have a balanced out team of different Pokemon, because every Pokemon, even the shitty ones, have a role to fulfill, and frankly is one of the many things that is missing from newer Pokemon games. And now, by removing those design philosophies without changing or doing something to incentivize players to catch Pokemon, no wonder the games feel less impactful or meaningful. Especially when these newer games are just handing out god tier Pokemon for free, like goddamn Costco samples. It just doesn't feel like an actual adventure anymore, because it feels like there's no point in catching Pokemon. But bless Pokewild, they didn't just find one way to make catching Pokemon interesting, they found two. First, Pokemon you catch drop resources. These can be building materials, they can be special materials, they can even be healing items. In fact, one of the best healing items in the entire game is dropped by Shuckle in any normal Pokemon game. Why the fuck would I ever want to catch a Shuckle? But that's the genius design of Pokewilds. It understands that players need to be incentivized to catch Pokemon, and making it so that certain resources are tied to Pokemon means that they are more likely to catch them for their benefit. Second, Pokemon still have moves that impact the overworld. You can still cut things, rock smash, fly, but now there is actually a legitimate reason behind doing those actions, because instead of being a barrier or an obstacle that the player has to get around, you now have the ability to utilize them to just explore, to create and build and have fun. And this also ties into our last section of why Pokewilds is so interesting. Sandbox design is somewhat shaped by this game. Think of any sandbox game you can think of. 7 Days to Die, Minecraft, Starbound, whatever. Terraforming is an inherent ability that is given to you by the game. When I boot up Minecraft, I don't have to worry about if I'm going to be able to mine stuff with the exception of harder materials. Technically, I can mine pretty much anything with the exception of obsidian right from the get-go. So what did Pokewilds do to change sandbox design forever? Take away terraforming abilities and put them into Pokemon. By taking these sandbox abilities and putting them into Pokemon, it not only forces you to get more creative with your teams, but to seriously think about which Pokemon you want. Because you cannot have every single terraforming ability at once, it is nigh impossible. And so, by forcing the players to pick and choose, you can build around certain circumstances and design choices that encourage interesting play. Now, I should say this, Pokewild still has some problems. One frustrating mechanic to me on a game design level is friendliness. Friendly Pokemon are just hanging out in the overworld and you can just grab them whenever you want. And that's kind of fine for the early game, but when you're able to grab Pokemon that can just destroy obstacles in your way, that's when it becomes a problem. Pokemon like Jumpluff or Lapras are just easily attainable and give you those terraforming abilities that the game designs around you not having, making parts of the game somewhat trivial just by pressing A. Along with that, I never really felt like the game expanded or forced me to use these abilities in clever or interesting ways. Even the dungeons in the game basically only require one ability, which is Flash, which means that you're gonna bring a fire type at least to most places. But what gets me excited about this game is just how well it understands old Pokemon design. And it's so cool seeing how they have adapted it into the modern day. But it can go beyond this. There's many ideas that can be expanded on here. Imagine having to use all these moves in a creative way to get to a boss fight at the end of a dungeon. This is one of the first Pokemon fan games that actually has me excited. I have played games like Pokewilds, like Pixelmon, or other survival-ish type Pokemon games. But Pokewilds is the first Pokemon fan game that truly understands its design roots and how to properly expand upon them. So, in other words, if you want an actual Pokemon game that is competently designed, play Pokewilds. It is a fusion of old and new design that is genuinely changing how I think about video games.